Okay, so get this. Today's deep dive, it's not just about some law on paper, and you know what I mean? We're getting into Venezuela's organic law on the right of women into a life free of violence. But it's like this document, it's like a window into this whole country's hopes, their struggles, what they want their society to be.
It really is. And the fact that we're going to be looking at the actual text of the law itself.
Not just someone summarizing it. Yeah.
Exactly. It gives us like a direct line, to understanding Venezuela's stance on this huge issue.
And what's crazy is it doesn't just deal with like the obvious stuff you might think, domestic violence, though of course it covers that. But it goes way beyond. We're talking violence against women at work, in healthcare.
And in media.
Right.
Yeah.
The way women are portrayed, all of it. Seriously, the scope of this law, it's huge.
And that right there, that breadth, that's our first hint that this law, it's not just reacting to violence after it happens, it's trying to get ahead of it, prevent it. This is about systemic change, going deep to the roots of why this violence happens in the first place.
And they're not shying away from how serious it is either. I mean, right out the gate, the law, it cites these stark statistics from 2006. Caracas, specifically, a woman killed every 10 days because of gender-based violence. Whoa.
Yeah, and putting those numbers right there in your face, that's a powerful statement. They're grounding the law in reality immediately. This isn't theoretical, right? It's life or death stuff.
For sure. And we're going to unpack the weight of those statistics more a little bit later on. But
yeah,
before we get too deep into like the present day situation, there's this historical link the law makes that I got to ask you about. They reference Olympe de Gouges, her Declaration of the Rights of Woman and the Citizen back in 1791. Why even bring that up? Why is that connection important?
Oh, Olympe de Gouges, what a fascinating figure, in the fight for women's rights. She was incredibly vocal, advocating for equality during the French Revolution.
An intense time period.
It was a time of huge GE upheaval, and tragically, she was executed for her beliefs.
Executed. Wow, that really puts things into perspective. It's not like the Venezuelan lawmakers were just like casually name-dropping some historical figure.
Exactly. By referencing de Gouges, they're connecting their 2007 law to this much larger story, the global ongoing fight for women's rights.
Right. It's adding this weight of history, showing how these issues, they resonate across centuries even. Okay, so we got to get into the actual details of this law, because there were some terms in there, I got to be honest. Even I try to follow this stuff, I was like, what?
Oh, I'm sure you're not alone. And you're right, this document gets surprisingly specific, which is great for us, more to unpack, right? Like, for example, it addresses symbolic violence. Have you ever heard of that term?
Honestly, not before reading this law, no. And it sounds kind of like philosophical,
It does have that ring to it, doesn't it? But it's actually a super important concept. Basically, symbolic violence is how the messages, the values, even just the symbols a society holds. Those things can reinforce inequality against women, discrimination, without it being outright physical violence.
So you're saying like stuff that's not a punch or a threat, but it still creates an environment where that kind of stuff is more likely to happen.
Exactly. You think about things like, stereotypes we see in media all the time, or unequal treatment of boys and girls in school. Even just how we talk about gender roles, right? Those might seem small on their own, but they add up. They build a culture where violence against women is more likely to be seen as, sadly, like normal or inevitable even.
And it's interesting because a lot of laws, they struggle to address that subtler stuff. So the fact that Venezuela included symbolic violence specifically, that's pretty forward thinking, don't you think?
Oh, absolutely. It suggests they were trying to be really thorough, not just focused on the violence itself, but the soil it grows in, the attitudes that let it take root.
Yeah, it's giving very much like we're going to solve the root cause, which I appreciate that. And it's not just symbolic violence either, right? There's this whole section on obstetric violence, and I'll be honest, that one threw me. I mean, I know childbirth ain't always a picnic, but what are we even talking about here?
Obstetric violence, it's a relatively new term, and it's specifically about harmful practices, disrespectful stuff that's done to women during pregnancy, during childbirth. It's being recognized more, but the fact that it's called OUT in this law, that says a lot. Like, what was going on in healthcare in Venezuela that made this a priority to include? That's something to think about.
Ooh, yeah, adding that to the list of things to investigate for sure. But just so I'm clear, can you give me an example or two? What would this obstetric violence actually look like in practice?
So think about it like this. A woman's going through labor, right? And they perform some medical procedure that honestly wasn't necessary, didn't get her consent. Or they just totally disregard the birth plan she made, or even like verbally abusing her during labor. It happens.
It's lawful.
It is. And it's a violation of her autonomy, her right to just basic respectful care during what should be like this incredibly powerful but vulnerable time.
I'm kind of blown away this is even a thing, to be honest. That something as like natural as childbirth could become a site of violence, it really makes the point that you need laws that address this stuff specifically, the less obvious stuff.
100%. By putting it in the law, by naming it, it validates the experience of women who've been through it, right? And it gives a basis for holding those responsible accountable, which is huge.
Speaking of accountability, something else that jumped out at me with this law, it's not just about punishment. Like, it lays out all these responsibilities for different government ministries, not just like the justice system. We're talking health, education, you name it. They all have a role to play in addressing this violence. It's wild.
And that right there, that's key EY to what this law is trying to do. It signals a shift, a big shift. We're moving away from just reacting after the fact to being proactive, changing attitudes, changing behavior across society, not just dealing with the damage after it's done.
It's recognizing that you can't just like pass a law and suddenly everything's fixed.
Right.
You need a more like holistic approach, I guess.
Exactly. It's multifaceted. And that's where these different ministries come in. Like, the law actually says you have to integrate this stuff, education about gender equality, healthy relationships, into the school curriculum.
Starting young makes sense.
Right. Start young, plant those seeds early. It's about prevention as much as it is about protection,
Totally. And it's not just top down either, which I thought was cool. Like, they recognize indigenous communities specifically as, I'm going to butcher this pronunciation, but denuncia receptors, basically places where women can report violence. It feels significant that they acknowledge different communities might need different ways to get help.
Oh, 100%. You picked up on a really important point there. By acknowledging those indigenous communities, their role, it shows the law is trying to be sensitive to how diverse Venezuela is culturally, right? One size fits all doesn't work with an issue this complex.
It's like they're trying to build like this whole safety net, and it's going to have different shapes to catch people where they are,
That's a great way to put it. It's about comprehensive support, making sure everyone's included.
This is honestly making me think about law totally differently now. It's not just rules and who gets in trouble. It's understanding a whole society, its fabric, and then trying to shape it to a place that's more just, more equal for everyone.
You got it. And when we're looking at this law through that lens, even those kind of grim statistics from the beginning, a woman killed every 10 days, it hits different now.
You're right. It wasn't just to grab our attention. It was, this is the baseline. This is what we're dealing with.
Exactly. Those weren't just numbers for shock value. They were highlighting the very real danger women faced even before this law, Coming forward, reporting violence, the stakes were high.
And you got to figure the women who did come forward in that environment, talk about courage.
Absolutely. And I think in a way that's part of what the law is trying to acknowledge by building this system, the system meant to protect and support the people who speak up.
So this law, it's been around for a while now, since 2007, right? Has it been successful? Like, have there been any big court cases or changes to the law itself since then that give us a sense of like how it's actually playing out in the world?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? I mean, getting a law passed, that's one thing, but actually changing how a whole society operates, that's a whole other beast, right?
Yeah, it's got to be way more complicated.
It is. And the truth is there have been, since it was put into place, since 2007, there's been both praise, people saying it's great, and criticism.
Oh, interesting. So it's not like a straight up success story. I guess nothing involving people ever really is when you think about it.
You got that right. Some people argue that the law, while ambitious, for sure, it's so broad, covers so much that it actually makes it hard to put into practice the same way everywhere. Different regions, different communities, they might need different things.
Right, yeah.
And there have been concerns about like resources, The law creates all these programs, these institutions, but is there enough money, enough support to actually make them work the way they're supposed to? That's been a big question.
Makes sense. It's like you can have the best blueprint in the world, but if you don't have the bricks and the people to build it.
Exactly. The effectiveness of ANY law, it always comes down to these practical things. How well is it enforced? Is there money behind it? Even just like the political will to keep pushing it forward. All that stuff matters, and it can change over time too. Which, actually, that could be a whole other deep dive, right?
For sure.
How the political situation in Venezuela, all the ups and downs since 2007, how that's impacted this law, that'd be fascinating to see.
Already making notes. It also makes me think about what we were talking about earlier with the whole symbolic violence thing. Even if you have a strong law, changing those really deep cultural attitudes, that stuff takes generations, right?
It does, and that's such a crucial point. Laws are tools, powerful tools, but they don't exist in isolation. To really make lasting change, you have to also be tackling the cultural stuff, the economic inequalities, making sure everyone has access to education. It's a lot.
It's like, well, what's a good metaphor? It's like trying to weave a new pattern into a tapestry, right? It takes time, and you can't just focus on one thread. The whole thing has to shift.
Love that. And you're absolutely right. And honestly, we're just scratching the surface here, right? There's so much more to uncover. Specific court cases, how Venezuela's unique culture plays into this, how it's all changed over time.
Like, we've opened this door and there's this whole room full of like fascinating stuff, but it's up to us to go in and explore it.
Exactly. That's the beauty of a good deep dive. It's just the beginning. Gets you thinking, gives you a solid foundation, and then it's on you to keep digging.
And speaking of stuff that got me thinking, there was this one phrase in the law, it really stuck with me. Justa democratica, a just democracy. It's like they're aiming for something even bigger than just, like, less violence.
Oh yeah, that phrase is powerful. It really gets at the ambition of this whole thing. They're not just trying to punish people after the fact. They're trying to build a society where women's rights are just fundamental, part of the air they breathe.
So the real test of whether this law worked, it's not just the numbers, right?
Yeah.
It's whether Venezuela is closer to that ideal, that jus democratica.
Exactly. And that's a question worth sitting with, you know. Your own deep dive, even. Look into it. See what's happened since 2007, the good, the bad, what's still changing. Who knows what you'll find.
Well, you've definitely given me a lot to think about. Today, we took a deep dive into Venezuelan law, but we ended up talking about, I don't know, it felt like way more than that. Social change, this whole cultural context, the fight for a better world, really.
And that's what makes these explorations so great, isn't it? There's always something new to learn, even or maybe especially about things we think we already understand.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Until next time, everyone, keep asking those questions and dive deep into whatever sparks your curiosity.